Hey everybody, welcome back to Coach Hall Writes. A couple years ago, I made a video about common mistakes that I was seeing on argument essays for AP Lang. And since it's been a couple years, I decided I wanted to revisit that topic and update that video. In fact, this is actually part of a series. So if you're interested in knowing the common mistakes that I see on synthesis essays and how to avoid them, check out the description below for a link to that video. I'll also be posting one for rhetorical analysis as well. And if you want to see the old common mistakes for Q3 video that I made, I will link that in the description box as well. As always, if you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe and turn those notifications on. That way you don't miss any upcoming AP Lang content. The first common mistake that I see in argument essays for AP Lang is that students have a weak thesis. You need to make sure that you pick a side. Don't try to argue both sides equally. We call that equivocating. You also don't want to just summarize both sides either. Generally speaking, we tend to see a lot of closed thesis statements for argument essays on the exam. And I think for a timed essay, this is perfectly acceptable. I encourage my students to include their reasons in their thesis. So for example, something like exploring the unknown is valuable because, and then they would have reason one and reason two. But what I tell my students is I don't want them to spoil their exact evidence. So let's say one of their reasons is that it leads to discovery. That would be a reason, but the actual discovery that they're going to talk about in their body paragraphs, I don't want them to put that example in their thesis. To me personally, it feels like it's kind of spoiling it. If you're looking for a more advanced sentence frame, you could try a counterargument thesis. These are the ones that start with although or though, where you acknowledge the counterargument and then assert your position. You are allowed to have a counterargument thesis even if you don't actually address the counterargument in your essay, because the thesis point is scored separately from your evidence and commentary. I do have other videos on thesis tips. So if you're looking for help with writing a strong thesis, definitely check out those videos as well. Another common mistake that I see students making is that they try to use very general or even hypothetical evidence. Based on the rubric, it's important to realize that your essay needs specific evidence. So I've given you a progression here to show you what that might look like. If your evidence is simply sports, that's way too general. You can make it somewhat specific by narrowing it down to gymnastics. However, even gymnastics is still rather general. So we can make it more specific by focusing on a particular gymnast, in this case, Simone Biles. And then from there, we want to think about more specifically, what is it we want to focus on? Well, let's say for the purposes of this example, we're going to focus on her comeback at the Paris Olympics. One way to double check if your evidence is specific enough is to focus on proper nouns. Do you have a specific person or event? Now, you do want to be careful with this, though, because things like the Civil War or the American Revolution, those technically are proper nouns, but they're still rather general. So if you're thinking about the Civil War, you want to narrow it down to a specific component of the war or maybe a particular battle. For the American Revolution, instead of talking about the entire revolution, maybe you're going to talk about the Stamp Act. So proper nouns are a good start, but remember that you want to be as narrow or as specific as possible. This is the first step in helping you get toward the 3 and the 4 in row B, evidence and commentary. In general, I tend to advise against hypothetical examples because oftentimes they're not convincing. And usually when I see students using hypothetical examples in their writing, there's usually a real world example that they could be using. I think sometimes students try to write hypothetical examples because they are worried that they're not supposed to use personal experience. So instead of talking about themselves, they'll say, imagine a high school student who does this, but really they're talking about themselves. Let me be clear. There are times when English teachers say, don't use first person in your writing. And when I say this, I mean things like, don't say, I think, I believe, or in my opinion. Those phrases weaken your writing. However, in an argument essay, you are allowed to use personal experience. It's a rhetorical choice that you can make. You could tell an anecdote. So if you're using a hypothetical example in place of actual personal experience, the personal experience is going to be stronger. Now, ideally, you won't only rely on personal experience for your essay. We do want to make other broader world connections as well, but personal experience is allowed and it's usually better than a hypothetical example. Speaking of personal experience, there's kind of a right way and a wrong way to do it. So as I've already said, yes, you can write about personal experience, but if you're going to do that, you want to make sure that the example you're including is relevant to the prompt itself. So you're going to need to establish appropriate context. Remember, the reader doesn't know who you are and they can't infer. You also want to make sure that the experience that you've chosen has a clear value, lesson, or moral that relates to the prompt. If you're looking for more tips and examples on how to write about personal experience, I do have a separate video on this that goes into much more detail. For the students who are struggling with getting from a 2 in evidence and commentary to a 3 in evidence and commentary, chances are you're struggling with the commentary portion. A lot of times students try to summarize their evidence and they don't actually analyze its significance. One way to start is to ask yourself, what does this example show or suggest? A lot of students who earn a 2 in row B at least have a sentence that says this example shows, and then they finish that sentence. But usually the reason why it stays at a 2 and doesn't progress to a 3 in evidence and commentary is because the explanation that follows is very superficial commentary. So you really want to dig deep in what is the actual lesson or revelation I'm trying to get the reader to realize by including this example, and why is this example important in proving my point? You had to have chosen the example for a reason. Don't assume that your reader is going to automatically understand how the evidence proves your thesis. That's the job of commentary. You have to be the one to say it. Here are a couple examples of what this could look like in student essays. So let's say that for this particular example, the evidence is going to be how the US invested in space exploration in the 1960s. Summarizing the evidence, which weakens your essay, would essentially be just restating what the evidence already said. Notice that in that example, it's not adding new information. And we've got really vague language like these innovations helped people in various ways. Now look at the stronger example. We're sticking with the same concept, except notice that this is not only longer, but it's much more specific. I bolded some phrases that I thought might be helpful for students. So you can see there that we have the dash and then further clarification. For those that are working on your writing style, practice using dashes or colons appropriately. These can be really refreshing to see students using advanced punctuation in a meaningful way in their writing. I also bolded the word demonstrate. Simply using the word demonstrate does not guarantee that you have strong commentary, but I do think it's helpful for students who are struggling with commentary to recognize that there are certain verbs that can help signal commentary. Demonstrate, highlight, suggest, illustrate, underscore, which means to emphasize. But notice that what follows the word demonstrate is much more specific here. There's even an added clause at the end reinforcing the argument that such pursuits drive human progress. Presumably, that's a connection back to the thesis. So adding a clause with an ing verb there at the end could be another way to tie everything together. Another common mistake that I see is what I'm going to call a lack of context. I think a lot of times this happens when students are writing about famous people or events because they assume that the reader knows what they're talking about. But here's the thing that you need to remember. Readers are not supposed to infer context. So let's say a student is writing about someone famous like George Washington or Rosa Parks. As a reader, yes, I am aware of who those people are. However, I'm not supposed to project my knowledge of that person onto your essay. Instead, you're supposed to guide me through that thought process. So some quick ways to fix the lack of context would be to include a person's credentials. So like, what was their title? Were they an activist? Were they a politician? You could also include the date or time period of an event. If you're not sure about the exact date, but you know the decade, that's fine too. You can use commas or dashes to offset the extra information that interrupts the sentence. Providing appropriate context helps you establish your commentary as well, because if your reader understands who the person is that you're talking about or why the event is relevant, then as you get to the commentary, it's going to be easier to explain the significance. Let me show you an example of what this could look like. So in our weak example, we have the US landed on the moon. This proves humans should always explore. So right there, we have very limited commentary, and there's essentially no context. In the revised example, it's much more specific. So notice for the revised example, we have a date. And again, if you didn't remember the exact date, you could just use the year. Worst case scenario, you could say in the late 1960s if you forgot the year. Notice that we now have specific names as well. So we have Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. Also, notice in the next sentence where it says, this achievement driven by the Cold War era space race. Okay, so that's some context as well. That's helping us understand the significance of the year and why this was an achievement. And then we have another commentary verb there, showcased. Now, in this particular example, there is a relatively famous quote followed by some commentary. Notice that we're connecting back to this idea of exploring the unknown and why it's valuable because it leads to advancements and innovation. But I want to be clear, you are not required to memorize quotes. In fact, if you're wondering how to study for question 3, I would recommend becoming very familiar with about 3 to 5 famous figures. If you want to add in a little more, I would maybe add in 3 to 5 current events as well. And start with people and events that you're actually already interested in. Maybe you have some outside knowledge of an athlete or a musician, or maybe there's a famous person that you've learned about in history class. I think one of the biggest hurdles that students face with question 3 is they're worried that they won't have good evidence, that they won't come up with examples off the top of their head. And I do think that can be very challenging, especially under the pressure of exam time constraints. But I also think it's important to recognize that as high school students, you do have a toolbox of knowledge that you can draw from. Here's another example of lack of context. I find that sometimes when students are writing about really famous people, that they forget to include that context, or maybe they oversimplify the context because they just assume that the reader is going to know. So you can see in the weak example, it's just a couple of sentences. It says Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. From that alone, we don't have any idea of what's actually happening. Whereas in the second example, we have a date, we have a place, we have a reference to what's going on in the time period. And if you're looking at this and you're like, okay, I know about Rosa Parks, but I wouldn't have known the exact year or date or something like that, that's okay. Remember, we could use time periods if needed. But I also think this is a lesson in picking the evidence that you could write about best. Sometimes the first example that pops in our head is not always the example that we should write about. In fact, some of the essays that I have found most interesting as a teacher and a reader have been the essays where students were clearly writing about a topic that they knew well, whether it was an athlete or a musician or a famous person. Sometimes going for that niche knowledge as opposed to the obvious example makes for a much stronger essay. Another common mistake for argument essays for AP Lang is weak counter arguments. It is not mandatory to address the counter argument. I do believe that this is a valuable skill for students to learn. And I do think for exam purposes, if you have a strong counterclaim and rebuttal or concession and refutation, and you have the time, you should include it. But I don't think every student should try to address the counter argument in every argument essay that they write. Now, for classroom purposes, that might be a different story. There are times as a teacher where I want my students to practice that skill. So I tell them, hey, in this essay, I want you to address the counter argument. But for exam purposes, I don't want my students trying to cram a counter argument in if it's not going to actually help their essay. And that's what I see a lot of times with these weaker counter arguments, is that oftentimes the counter argument itself is maybe not logical, or there's not enough time to develop it. So it's actually weakening the argument as opposed to bolstering it. It's also important to recognize that the counter argument can be anywhere in the essay, so it can be its own paragraph. A lot of students tend to put it as a third body paragraph. I think just because that way, if they need to cut it, they can, and the rest of their essay is still intact. A lot of my students actually like to weave their counter argument into an existing body paragraph. That way they're still just doing 2 body paragraphs, but they use it as a way to develop one of their main ideas. So on exam day, you need to recognize that as a writer, you have certain choices to make. And one of those choices for an argument essay is going to be, should I address the counter argument? Do I have a strong counterclaim and rebuttal or concession and refutation? If so, do I have time to execute it properly? And where does it belong in my essay? All right, there you have it. Those are the most common mistakes that I see on AP Lang argument essays. Don't forget that this is part of a mini series, so be sure to check out the description box below for other common mistakes videos. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up. feel free to share it with AP Lang students. And also don't forget to subscribe. That way you don't miss any upcoming videos as we prepare for the AP Lang exam. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, happy writing!